Thank you, Janae. Thank you all so much for being here and sticking around, even though it wasn't the original session. So you met Janae, but I'm Ashleigh. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm also with VALOR and PreventConnect, and I'd love to have other co-presenter introduce.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Shelby Vice, pronouns she, her, and I'm a project coordinator with VALOR and oversee the prevention in California.
Thank you, Shelby. So the things that we're hoping to do here today, we really want to kind of just share about what we've been hearing. We are technical assistance providers, and so we've been hearing a lot about prevention practitioners not being able to do programming in schools. And a lot of it is tied to the political climate that's going on right now. So we want to share some of what we've been hearing. We want to also share some of the solutions that preventionists have been identifying and also hear that from you all. And then we want to have you all define a strategy and action steps to be able to navigate through some of that hostility and those barriers to continue your prevention work. So with that, I mean, when I say pushback, I literally mean pushback. We have heard across the country people not being able to use language like social emotional learning, oppression. We have heard that even like healthy relationships is now like a bad term. Health equity is something that is like triggering people from thinking that there's other things happening in classrooms. And we've seen this all over the country. In California, there have been bans on critical race theory. There have been bans on social emotional learning. A lot of what we know works to prevent sexual violence is being banned from being taught. And some of it is being conflated with prevention, and some of it is being like misinformation. There's a lot of just misinformation going on about what sexual violence prevention actually is. So anything that has to do with like gender or sexuality is being banned at the school level. And a lot of this is very, very organized by small groups, but they are like a critical mass. Right? Like it's not the consensus maybe of the parents, but this critical mass is making these really big changes at the district level and sometimes even at the state level. So we have just heard so many times that people are just not able to do their work. They're not able to implement their prevention curriculum or any work with youth. At the same time, we also have seen the way that organizations are responding. So the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence was hearing a lot about grooming being co-opted and really being used to as like a transphobic and anti-LGBTQ strategy. So they put out some messaging around what grooming actually is. So that's what I mean when I say there's like misinformation being spread very purposefully, but what's happening is it's getting in the ears of people who are not necessarily like super hostile, but they just hear something and don't know any better, and it scares them. And so this just keeps spreading. The Ohio Alliance Against Sexual Violence has also done a lot when it comes to bans on critical race theory and social emotional learning. And then we're seeing other organizations outside of sexual violence organizations who are trying to do messaging around what social emotional learning actually is, because when parents are described social emotional learning, 80% of them want it, but when you use the word social emotional learning, they don't want it. So there's a lot going on there. And last week we hosted on, is anyone part of PreventConnect's community? Have you gone to PreventConnect web conferences, podcasts? Okay, great. So for those of you who aren't familiar, we host a lot of peer learning events. And so we hosted a town hall last week and we heard from, I think 5, Janae, is that right?
At least 5. I think there might have been more than 5, but yeah. Several organizations from across the country, several organizations from across the country, from local centers, like what some of you may be from. Planned Parenthood wasn't able to make it there, but we connected with them earlier, to larger organizations who are all dealing with pushback in different ways. For some of them, literally just doing healthy relationship education, where they're going to schools and schools aren't wanting them to use the term healthy relationships. Others really struggling with any mention of gender or sexuality. Others struggling with sexual health education. So really bringing together peers from across the country to share about their experience.
Yeah, and we did not record that session, but we want to continue the conversation through, we'll be producing a resource with all of the key takeaways from that and also from what we are able to generate today together. And so I think we'd like to just briefly hear from you all.
Yeah, we would love to hear. So we're not going to actually spend a lot of time talking about the pushback from our perspective. There are some things out there. If you want some background information on that, we have a PreventConnect podcast that came out a couple of months ago. That's the LGBTQ rhetoric and the misuse of the word grooming. So you can check that out for free at PreventConnect.org. Sarah Ferrato from the Ohio Alliance also did a session on this earlier this week, and it will be coming out as a recording later. So what we really want to do is focus on what you're all seeing rather than spend all the time doing the background information. So we'd love to open it up now and hear from you. Shelby's going to go around with the mic, so raise your hand if you have something you would like to share. But why are you here? What are you experiencing in your community or at your organization that brought you to this peer learning session today? Thank you. Yeah, so I'm hearing the schools are asking, it's easy to ask you to come and fill gaps where they need to fill gaps, but when you say this is best practice, they say, you know what, we've got it covered. We actually don't need you. So thank you. I'm hearing a couple of things there. One, we know that one-off presentations, they're good to get our foot in the door. We're not going to say no to them, but that's not primary prevention. That's not best practice. So it sounds like for you, you're like, this isn't even fully what we could do for you, but there's already pushback and reports to that, which is so, so hard. Thank you for sharing. That is a shared experience. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's one of the reasons we even started having these conversations. We saw all of the legislative changes that were happening. Just because someone is a legislator does not mean that they understand sexual violence, intimate partner violence, definitely not prevention. And the co-opting of this language is, a lot of it really plays on emotion and fear. So it's easy to sway people. And it's an especially hard position to be in when we're in nonprofits, and it can feel intimidating and even like not allowed to interact with legislators because there's the thin line between education and policy advocacy. So like, what do you even do? I appreciate you bringing that up. And we are going to talk about what some people in nonprofits are doing in policy within like grant restrictions and stuff. So thank you. Also, what a tough position to be in. I remember when I was in a local center and I would go to web conferences, I'd have this conversation with our leadership staff and be like, I'm being told one thing when I go to all of these trainings, all this technical assistance that I'm getting is telling me to do this thing, but I'm fighting everyone in my local community and even sometimes other staff to be able to do that thing. And that's, for us coming down, so PreventConnect is a project, and this isn't a PreventConnect session, but it's funded largely by the Centers for Disease Control. And so they put out Veto Violence, the Stop SV technical package, and they really are uplifting health equity, intersectional approaches, anti-racism as strategies to prevent sexual violence. But people in a lot of cases aren't able to do that. So we're trying to fill that gap. Thank you. Anything else that anyone wants to share about what you're experiencing, why you're here, pushback that's happening in your community?
So what we learned from that conversation and what is being echoed here are The pushback is around anything that has to do with acknowledging that LGBTQ people exist, anything about gender identity, any mention of sex, any mention of race, misinformation about social emotional learning, lots of conversation that this is the parent's role, this is a parent's job to provide that information, and then a lack of buy-in from school districts. And that varies. Some of the school districts have been very willing to do this, and because of the pushback, they are now backing away. Others, it's always been a problem, right? It's always been something that's not seen as an issue in their district. So those are a lot of the same things that you all were saying. But what was really great that came out of that conversation and what we're excited to get to today are some of the solutions that were identified. So Janae and I are going to talk a little bit about what some of those solutions were. Do you want to start, Janae?
Yeah. And, these are not like by the book, this is how you do this. It's not in a technical package. It's not a one size fits all for solutions. These are a few. There could be others that come out today that we'd love to hear from you. Even though we have a similar shared experience of pushback, every community is different. Every school is different. And I want to validate too how hard it can be to design different approaches for every different school that you're in. So this is hopefully just a starting place for you all. Our goal here is to give some flexibility and some guidance for the tools that if you're experiencing something to try out different things. So these were solutions that were shared by those guest presenters in our town hall that worked for them. And we're going to provide a brief overview of what these looked like, but a lot of the time here is going to be spent thinking about what they could look like for you. So the first solution that a lot of people offered was taking prevention outside of the classroom. And this doesn't mean ignoring the classroom completely. We know that classrooms are a great place to reach youth. And whenever we talk to youth, they want us in the classroom. So it should always be our goal to be in the classroom in some way, but that's not the only way to reach school-aged youth, right? I think that there can sometimes be a conflation of school-aged youth equals be in school, and that's not always what happens. We have heard about organizations hosting summer camps or partnering with summer camps. We have heard about organizations partnering with libraries and doing programs, having book reading programs, book discussions. We've heard of community organizing programs. There are more ways to engage youth outside of a school than having your own youth program, which can feel like a really big lift. And so in this one, people are thinking about what are creative ways that we can engage youth where we don't necessarily have to worry about the fear that administrators have of getting in trouble. Because we know that the vast majority of parents are not going to have a problem. They want their kids to engage with prevention. It's the fear that administrators have of a select few parents that keep us out of the classroom.
Yeah, the second one that was identified was really kind of like a gateway to what Janae talked about, and that is building relationships. So a lot of what we heard was that building relationships with other community partners who maybe do have an in with the school, who maybe are not focusing on a topic like ours, but who could still take some of what is so important about sexual violence prevention into their programming. So really building new relationships with community partners, building relationships with parents. So, like I said, a lot of this is very organized. It's very deliberate. It's a political agenda. But there are some parents who just are afraid of what they're hearing. And once they understand what the programming actually looks like, they're more willing to engage with that. So we did have one program who they said, okay, the parents want to know what their youth are learning in the classroom. We'll actually do the curriculum with the parents. And so they hosted the curriculum so the parents could actually see your children are not being indoctrinated into something. And so that relationship piece, I think, is really foundational.
That's another thing to think about, right? Like, our schools are also overburdened. Every person that I talk to that works at a school, whether they're a counselor or a teacher, is stressed the heck out. And we can help. And that's what I hear some people trying to brand their programs as. Maybe it's not this year you're going in and doing curriculum. Maybe that's going to take a couple of years. I heard about a program in California that was really struggling to get into a school district to teach curriculum, but they knew that the school district was struggling with sexual harassment and they didn't have a policy. So they said, well, let's write your sexual harassment policy. We can do some of this work with you. And then a year, 2 years later, they built trust with administrators, where eventually they were like, okay, you're not actually that scary. Maybe you can come in for one of those one-day presentations. It doesn't always have to be just the curriculum that you have. Thank you for sharing that. Another solution that we heard is leveraging policy, which can feel really scary for a lot of people. I totally understand that, because you say policy and people say no lobbying, and that makes a lot of sense. There are ways to leverage and educate around policy without lobbying for elected officials or bills. An example of this in California, so I live in California, but I live in a very red county of California. California has the California Healthy Youth Act. So it's one of the few states that has mandates around comprehensive sexual health education. I know that even though we have that law, a lot of school districts are not in compliance. And school districts get scared when you say the word non-compliance. So I would go around to administrators and have a conversation. Did you know that this law just recently got passed? We want to check in with you and see if there's anything that we can do to help. I've also heard of programs leveraging a lack of policy. So maybe your state doesn't have something mandating something, but has like a gray area over here that can stress school districts out. You know, really try to get familiar even with what's going on in your local political landscape and how you can help. If you're in a community where there is a lot of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric and you're seeing that make its way to the school board, talk about, you can meet with people and talk about how you can help in those situations. You can also do education around what policy is as people who work at nonprofits. And so that can be if something is happening and you're seeing some misinformation going around about it. For example, a couple of months ago in my county, some people were pushing for a change in school district policy about all gender bathrooms, right? And that was in response to a law that had been passed that parents didn't like. And so an opportunity there would be educating around what that change would actually mean. That's not leveraging, or that's not lobbying for a policy one way or another. There are a lot of ways to engage with policy without writing or lobbying for policy.
And I think to do that, the thing that we have to really start to build our muscles around is how we message our work and how we message the connections between preventing violence and things like social emotional learning, critical race theory, gender identity, community connection. A lot of times we use words that don't mean anything to most people, especially legislators. And so it's really kind of figuring out how do you explain what you do in a way that makes sense for people? How can you clearly show what we know about sexual violence and prevention in a way that will engage people's values and emotions? So some of it is about storytelling. It was a lot. We talked a lot about adapting prevention messaging. How do we adapt it in a way? And it might be that we have to adapt it for different audiences, right? Because every one of us has different values. And so what speaks to me might be different than what speaks to Janae. The reason that I might get behind wanting, social emotional learning taught in schools might be different than why Shelby wants it. It's probably the same, but you get the point. And so how do we message? And again, that's something that I know I definitely struggle with. When I try to explain to my family what I do for work, their eyes glaze over. Right? Because I'm saying things that it doesn't mean anything to anyone that's not doing this. So it's something that I think we as a field really need to work on and practice. And I think too, this solution can also be a bit of a slippery slope in that it could allow us to kind of leave some of our values by the wayside. What I mean by that is, some people are choosing, okay, you don't want me to talk about gender identity or LGBTQ relationships. I won't do that just so I can go into school. Well, what does that say about our values? What does that say about those students that are LGBTQ in those spaces? Right? And so I think we have to really kind of have a reckoning with ourselves. What are our boundaries? What are things that we absolutely will not say no to? What do schools have to let us talk about in order for us to do something effective? There's a lot of things that we can educate people around the prevalence of sexual violence all day. That doesn't change anyone's attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. It just makes them be able to say a statistic. So I think really thinking about how do we message and what are the important parts of our message is so critical.
Thank you. The only thing I'll add to that on the flip side, so on one end, it can be a slippery slope of just veering away from anything that could be controversial. On the other hand, I don't know about anyone else, but I feel very personally connected to the work that I do and therefore sometimes attached to the terminology. And it takes an intentional conversation with myself and my colleagues about whether that is doing harm or good and whether or not the same content could be delivered with a different message. So sometimes when people say, I don't want you talking about trans kids, I want to be like, well, then you get nothing because that is ridiculous and I hate you. And part of me still feels that way. But when we did the town hall, we talked to someone from Missoula, and she shared that she doesn't explicitly mention transgender and LGBTQ people in her presentations. My first thought was, I don't agree with that. And then she shared that she wears a rainbow pin when she goes, and she's really intentional about the pronouns that she uses and the names that she uses. And she acknowledged, it's really hard. And some days I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I just have to be really, really intentional about the content that I'm delivering and know my hard boundaries, like Ashleigh said, and talk to my colleagues and my organizations about my hard boundaries. Sarah Ferrato, who did a session earlier this week and the recording is coming out, referred to it as culturally competent care. So Sarah, in a conversation with me in a podcast we had a couple of weeks ago, said, if we're using terminology that doesn't resonate with our communities or scares our communities, is that culturally competent care? Can we do things that both live into our values and resonate with our peers? And then the last solution that we heard was leveraging youth power. And so this takes a lot of deconstructing adultism. So our idea of we're the experts and youth are not. There are a few ways that I've seen leveraging youth power work. I know some organizations that rely on their youth volunteers or their paid youth staff to actually give the presentation. So they train students to give their own presentations. I think One Love does that. And they have found that teachers are a lot less adverse to a student coming and saying, I'm really passionate about this thing, I want to talk about it, than they would be to a stranger. We've also heard about youth organizing. I think it was Vermont, someone shared that a parent was really frustrated about LGBTQ inclusive content that the local program was providing in the school. So a mom brought an anti-trans speaker to the school to give a talk. The students were enraged and they asked this organization if it would support a protest. And so hundreds of youth came together at this school and protested this speaker. And it made it on local and national news. And the school listened because it wasn't the organization that was leading the conversation. They may have provided resources and training behind the scenes, but it was the youth vision that they really aligned with and supported to get that work done.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add on that is that one thing that our speaker from Vermont said was, they said that it was really matching adult fear to youth power. And I just love that so much because this is what it's really about. It is fear-based, and we know that our youth are super powerful. The only solution that I would just have to plug that wasn't identified is that, you know, in some ways, I see this as an opportunity for us to level up our prevention work and take it from like the individual and relationship level and perhaps start working more on community level changes. So things like doing work around economic justice. We know that that is a sexual violence prevention strategy. You don't necessarily have to talk about sexual violence to do it. So in places where like you really cannot do anything about, you know, talking about sexual violence, there are strategies that get to risk and protective factors that would still be really, really critical and important that people probably wouldn't have so much hostility towards. So
taking prevention outside of the classroom, I see teen trivia at a rec center. I love that. Rec centers are great places, and teen trivia is an awesome way to engage teens in some fun stuff. And you can even engage them in like creating the questions on their own. Teen Center, Boys and Girls Club, churches, open houses, libraries, movie screenings. Yes, meeting youth where they're at. Yeah, finding out, where do you hang out? Do you have a favorite coffee shop? This is, you know, this kind of comes into building relationships. You have to build trusting relationships with youth in order for these things to work. Give out cool swag and games when doing outreach. Yes, youth, in my experience, they love a little spin wheel, and bring food, bring pizza, do things that are going to be fun for youth. Don't just like tokenize them and ask them to be a part of your programs. Okay, I see adapting messaging and some asterisks. Yes. Okay, so omit gendered language, de-gender our lessons. Absolutely. Focusing boundaries instead of consent. Sorry, that was loud. Boundaries instead of consent. Maybe for someone who shared this, what do you mean by that? Like, would the lesson change at all, or what was the thought process behind that?
I just shared with my table that the curriculum that we use to go into middle schools is called It's My Space, and it strictly talks about boundaries, recognizing and forming your own, respecting and accepting other people's. So it covers all the prevention things, but we just don't use that language.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I see healthy relationships beyond romantic relationships. So talking about friends and family, maybe teaching the same skills. So that could be an age-appropriate adaptation, or if people aren't wanting you to talk about relationships, that's awesome. Data supporting the message. I love that. There are a few pieces of data that can be really helpful for this kind of stuff. This is another shameless plug for PreventConnect. A lot of it exists on our website. The Youth Risk Behavior Survey came out last year, and it's really, really helpful in supporting why some of this is important. We know with primary prevention, especially when we talk about things that make sexual violence more likely to happen and less likely to happen, creating safe and healthy communities is a protective factor that reduces the chances of violence, that prevents violence, and you don't even necessarily have to talk about sexual violence in order to do that.
I just want to note too, when it comes to framing, there's a really good resource online around like how to develop your message, how to figure out if you're trying to engage a certain stakeholder, like how to adapt that, how to frame it, how to look at your shared values, how to identify any potential barriers or stipulations that they might have already. So that when you go in, if they're like, I did a lot of work in faith-based communities, and it was always like, don't talk about sex. And like Janae said, was like, don't talk about LGBTQ plus kids. or anything around gender. And so it was like one of the biggest things that ended up working for that community was framing it in a way for them to understand why it was important, because kids were being harmed at those schools, saying you don't have to be sexually active to be sexually assaulted. And like that was the key takeaway from that, they were understanding why it was so important for us to be in those communities, was because they were like, yeah, no, it's violence, right? It's not consensual, it's violence. And you're like, okay, I said that a million times other ways, but yeah. So it's Berkeley Media Studies Group. That website's really cool. They have a lot of information around framing and how to kind of adapt your messaging in a way that, like Ashleigh was saying, doesn't get rid of your values as an organization or just someone in this work that's passionate about it, but does it in a way that brings people in still. So I just want to highlight that.
Awesome. Thank you. Shelby is a huge resource. She does all of our TA for prevention in California. So if you have any specific questions, I would definitely go to Shelby after this session. So the next one we're talking about is building youth power. And I'm loving what I'm seeing here. So paid internships. Love that. We should be compensating youth for their time 100%. If we want to engage with youth, we should partner with youth first. If you can't do paid internship, providing volunteer credit hours. I love that. Some common themes that I'm seeing here are appreciating youth strengths, not asking them to fit into a box that we created for them. Sometimes the best way to engage youth is to just start with no plan at all. So I see something on here with an asterisk, youth-centered roundtable. No adults can speak. I love that. Host 10 of them at some of those events over here. Do them in different ways. You know, maybe people aren't going to come to like a 4 o'clock roundtable at your center, but how can you turn a teen trivia night into a learning opportunity for you and a way to build relationships? Ask youth what they want and how they want to be supported and meet them where they're at. I love that. So thinking about the protests that we mentioned in Vermont, that didn't start with a plan from the center. Sometimes youth are going to want to do something that you haven't thought about. I remember I was working with some youth and they said, we really want to organize around the climate crisis. And even though I understood the intersections of climate justice and sexual violence prevention, I wasn't sure how that was going to fit into my grant. And so I kind of shut them down, if I'm being honest, when I was a baby preventionist. And I wish that I didn't do that. I think about what could have changed if I would have run with them. That's our job. And then we can talk to our funders or whoever about how it connects.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely utilize those protective factors, and talking like community connectedness is a huge protective factor for violence. And there's so many ways that you can build community that's not outwardly being like, we're here to talk about consent and boundaries, you know? So definitely bringing people in that way too.
Awesome. So the next one is building relationships. And I see a lot here, so we're going to run through it pretty quickly. So training the trainers. Love that. How can you fill in the needs even if you're not the one doing the work in the schools? Just be present. Show up without an ask. Support what they're doing. Absolutely. And make sure that your organization is on board with that is part of the work. I see a Driving Hope program, going to different businesses, parks, wherever youth may be at. Yeah. I see Friday Night Live. So maybe it's not a classroom that you're in. Maybe you're partnering with a different program or a club. Clubs can be great ways to get in. For people who worked on the building relationships one, is there anything that really stood out to you or that you really want to share about that piece? Okay, thank you. I also see leveraging champions in the schools, PTAs, parent meetings, after school programs, multidisciplinary partners, combining efforts, and youth being the experts. Yeah, 100%. So I don't see a whole lot in here about us going in and doing a classroom presentation. I see a lot about other creative ways that we can be in the schools that might require shifting the way we do things a little bit.
And we all know prevention funding is few and far between, and we don't have enough of it. And building those relationships, especially with like after school programs where they do have funding, going to like, if you know youth are going, like when I was doing prevention work in the schools, there was this pizza place that the kids went to after school. And I went to the owner and was like, hey, like we don't have money to put towards food, and food is a huge way to bring people in. When the kids come here, would you potentially donate a couple pizzas towards this. And it ended up being a really great relationship and community member. And they were creating a safe space that we talked about prevention in that pizza parlor, so.
Thank you. So a few things on leveraging policy that I want to talk about. These are great. I love youth-driven policy change efforts. And I'm also seeing on here, it can be hard to leverage some policies when voters are opposed to that work. I want to validate that. Something that the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence does is every Orange Day, so Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month, they bring youth to the Capitol and have a rally at the Capitol. And that is something that legislators go to and they hear what youth have to say. Sometimes Sexual Assault Awareness Month, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month, it can feel like we're stuck in the awareness thing. And it's a time when people pay attention a little bit more. So how can you get youth to city council meetings? How can you use a proclamation, which is something that people really hopefully aren't going to oppose, or you'll have less opposition to build toward policy? I also see supporting the Healthy Youth Act. So there is a federal Healthy Youth Act. And I want to speak on this just for a moment too, because as nonprofits, we actually can engage with some policy. It just depends on what we can do in our jobs, right? So what we cannot do is endorse anyone running up for election. We can educate around what the Healthy Youth Act does. And it might be worth a conversation with someone at your organization. Maybe your grant can't interact with RHEA, but someone else can. That's something that VALOR does. So the position that I am funded through, I can't do any policy lobbying, but we have funds set aside for when something comes up so that I can still engage in that. We're at a time where we really need to be engaging in the policies around us. It's not impossible. It just takes creativity and commitment from organizations. I'm really glad that you brought that up because it is really hard to interact with policy. Like, where do you even look? Some resources, the ACLU has some great resources searching by state. I think Advocates for Youth also does. And SIECUS, SIECUS, I think it's Sex Ed for Social Change or something like that. They have great state profiles. I would really encourage you to take some time on paid work time with support from your organization to read into your local ordinances and policies. And if you don't know, spend some time Googling or connect with community partners, because on the local level, you might have a lot more of an opportunity to move the needle, or you can find things like there isn't a sexual harassment policy at a school. It is a steep learning curve, 100%, and I'd be happy to give some more resources. So you can use this however feels right to you, but the intent here is after we've done this learning, this peer learning about all of these strategies, we want to give you some guidance and some structure to think about how you can use that strategy back with your team. So on this action plan, there is a step or a section to pick a strategy. So you can do one, you can do multiple. We'll also have downloadable versions of this at PreventConnect.org, and to do some brainstorming with your team of what it would take to really invest in that strategy. So think about your strengths. What do you already have going for you at your organization, in your community, that can help you to really invest in this strategy? What are some growth areas or weaknesses that you can grow to be better and set yourself up for success? Who are your allies in this work? Who are other organizations or friends or neighbors or business partners? Really get creative. I mean, I would recommend like a big piece of butcher paper and draw out all of your connections who are in your corner and that you can lean on for support. And who are some adversaries or people who might push back against the work that you're doing? Try to think through some ways that you can engage with those people, or some safety plans for yourself, some self-care plans for yourself, some community care. It can be really hard to do this work. We have a Moms for Liberty chapter in my local community, and every time that I go to a school board meeting, I'm completely wiped afterwards. How can we set up some space for our colleagues and for ourselves to be able to show up authentically in those ways without burning out? What are some next steps that you want to take when you get home? And who do you need to connect with when you get home? Maybe they're allies that you want to have that you don't currently have. Again, everyone hopefully has one of these, and this will be up on PreventConnect probably next week. So that kind of does it for our structured time. We have a few minutes left. The plenary is happening right after this, so if you need a few extra minutes to get to the plenary, we love that, but also want to open it up if anyone has any questions. Of course, thank you. Thank you for engaging with the space.